Cuban Missile Crisis. 13-day confrontation over the Soviet Union building missile bases in Cuba. The United States decided on a military blockade. They would not permit offensive weapons to be delivered to Cuba. U.S. and Soviet Union came to an agreement to avoid nuclear war, often considered as Kennedy's greatest foreign policy success. After a week of secret deliberation, Kennedy announced the discovery of the world. And imposed a naval blockade on further shipments of armaments to Cuba during the Cold War. The proximity of Cuba meant Florida was a focal point during the Cold War, prepared for Bay of Pigs invasion in Florida. Many Cuban refugees settled in Florida used radio stations and broadcasted into Cuba. Also, the space race impacted Florida. All of the American rockets launched into space took off from Cape Canaveral. To prosperity. Pent-up desire for consumer goods unavailable during the Cold War and spend money to spend savings from defense work, service pay, and war bond investment leads to economic growth. Cold War keeps defense spending high and people employed. Demand for housing, suburbs especially, also increases employment and economic growth. GI Bill of Rights, created by Congress in 1944 to help servicemen readjust the civilian life, pays part of the tuition, guarantees a year worth of unemployment benefits, and offered low-interest federally guaranteed loans. Babies born in the years after World War II, birth rate, number of babies born per 1,000, increased for more than a decade after the war ended. As the height of the baby boom, one American infant was born every 7 seconds. The result was the largest generation in the nation's history highway system. Network of highways that united the country, created from 1956 Federal Highway Act, contributed to the nation's prosperity and encouraged the growth of suburbs, as people could use the highways to drive into work in the cities. Proposed as Dwight D. Eisenhower's National System of Interstate and Defense Highways. As of 2013, has been extended to the total length of 47,856 miles. About 1/4 of all vehicle miles driven in the country use the interstate system. Cost since 2006, $425 billion.
To prosperity. Minorities found it hard to obtain the same prosperity. They were excluded from middle-class jobs and the opportunity to move to the suburbs. African Americans in the South, and many were still tenant farmers, but in the North they were hired for low-wage jobs. Also, Hispanic Americans that were in the West were working as migrant farm workers. Society. President Johnson's ambitious program to end poverty and racial injustice. Congress passed 206 of his measures, including Medicare, Medicaid, Project Head Start, Immigration Act of 1965, Civil Rights Act of 1964, and Voting Rights Act of 1965. These programs helped but led to a growing budget deficit. And soon, these programs were overshadowed by the Vietnam War. The goal was to eliminate poverty and racial injustice. It brought many new liberals to Congress. The Geneva Conference in 1954 split Vietnam into two, the Communists in the north and the Vietnamese Emperor in the south. The U.S. replaced France as the South Vietnamese chief supporter. Why? Because they had a fear of communism, a belief in democracy, and an example to the Allies, and they underestimated the enemy. Kennedy sent troops to support the South Vietnam against the North Vietnam. Johnson continued and tried for peace, while Nixon continued to work out a peace treaty. Ford did nothing when North Vietnam took over all of Vietnam, uniting the country under communism. This contributed to Americans' lack of faith in the government. Domino theory was the idea that countries on the brink of communism were like dominoes set up in a line. If one went over, they would all go down. Southeast Asian Treaty Organization was an alliance of the United States and other countries similar to NATO, but in Southeast Asia. They felt obligated to protect South Vietnam from communist aggression. This was an international organization for collective defense in Southeast Asia, signed as part of the American Truman Doctrine of creating anti-communist, bilateral, and collective defense treaties. These treaties were intended to create alliances that would contain communist powers. The Gulf of Tonkin Incident. It was an alleged attack on the United States ships by North Vietnamese ships in the Gulf of Tonkin, which is off of North Vietnam's coast. That prompts President Johnson to ask for and get broad military powers. in Vietnam. Later, information revealed that the United States had been conducting secret raids against North Vietnam, and Johnson had prepared his request to Congress months beforehand. This information began to lead to American distrust of the government.
Surprise attack by the Viet Cong in many South Vietnam cities. U.S. and the South Vietnamese forces eventually regained control, but this attack and the subsequent fighting changes U.S. public opinion. Many, including the media, became critical of the war. Nixon's plan to gradually turn over the control of the war to the South Vietnamese while slowly withdrawing U.S. troops is Vietnamization. During the Vietnam War, the U.S. intended to end their involvement in the war and expand, equip, and train South Vietnam's forces and assign to them an ever-increasing combat role. This fit into the broader detente policy of Nixon's administration, in which the U.S. no longer regarded this fundamental strategy as a containment of communism, but as a cooperative world war. Peace Accords. It's a ceasefire agreement in January of 1973 with the North Vietnamese based on removal of all U.S. troops. The United States was still allowed to provide military and economic aid to South Vietnam. This intended to establish peace in Vietnam and to end the Vietnam War. It ended direct U.S. military involvement and temporarily stopped fighting between the North and South at home during the Vietnam War. There were two groups that supported and disproved the Vietnam War: Doves and Hawks. The Doves wanted the U.S. to withdraw from Vietnam. Hawks thought all military effort could bring victory and stop the spread of communism. The draft was instituted, and some attempted to find ways around the draft. Conscientious objectors opposed to the war on religious or moral grounds and did not see combat could still serve. Watergate scandal. During the 1972 presidential election, a break-in occurred at the Democratic Party headquarters. Nixon attempted to cover up his involvement and eventually resigned rather than face impeachment. This contributed to the Americans' growing lack of faith in their government at this time. Equal Right Amendment, or ERA. This proposed amendment guaranteed women equal rights with men. This amendment was first proposed in 1923 and then submitted to Congress every year until 1972, when it was approved by both houses. The states had 7 years to ratify it, and only 35 did ratify it. Workforce. During World War II, about 8 million women entered the workforce. Many left the workforce after the war, but by 1960, 40% worked for wages. Most jobs available to women were poorly paid. Domestic work, retail sales, teaching, and nursing were examples of the jobs that women held. Kennedy's Presidential Commission on the Status of Women brought many discriminatory practices to light with their report in 1963. This brought awareness to women's unequal status in society. Urban League. Founded in the first decade of the 20th century to increase job opportunities for African Americans. Based in New York City and advocated on behalf of African Americans and against racial discrimination in the United States.